Well, I think it's a first taste of what we might get over the next few years. I think it goes to show that those that thought the look at Trump 2.0 through the lens of his first term, thinking that it would be disruptive but ultimately manageable, may actually be mistaken. It's actually quite a serious issue. It's easy to dismiss it as something of a gimmick, but Greenland is very strategic. It's full of natural resources. It's key for the Arctic, and I think any interference there could potentially open up opportunities for Russia and even China to interfere. So one to watch closely in the coming months for sure.
I wonder, though, where that lives the European Union versus the US, because obviously with Donald Trump coming in, there's more pressure on European countries to spend more on defense. They're trying to get the US to keep some sort of support for Ukraine going forward. But now these comments around Greenland, how do you look at the transatlantic relationship going forward?
Well, I think Europe, alongside China, is probably one of the two regions that has the most to lose under Trump 2.0. We're cautiously optimistic about the prospect of a ceasefire in Ukraine this year, which is certainly good news. But this doesn't mean that even if there is a ceasefire, there would be a comprehensive peace agreement, which I think remains highly unlikely. I think most parties in the conflict have an interest in seeing a halt to the fighting, Russia included, although Putin will be the hardest sell, I think. But a comprehensive peace agreement, I think, remains out of reach. We're actually, more sanguine on European defense than I think many other observers. I think, if anything, the return of Trump will serve as something of a shock to the system that will serve to focus minds in Brussels. Europe, I think, remains united on the Ukraine issue, despite some friction at the margins from the likes of Hungary and others. I think the prospects of an increase in defense spending even, I think, are somewhat underappreciated at the moment on the part of the EU. But this doesn't change the fact that even in the event of a ceasefire, with the weakening US commitment to European security, Europe's security architecture will remain worse off than it was before, not least given that Russia, I think, will remain a spoiler going forward and continue its activities to asymmetrically attack NATO on a number of fronts.
Exactly on this topic, we are seeing, and we have the European defense stocks on the screen at the moment, we are seeing them moving higher today exactly because of one of the narratives is that we are seeing more spending going forward as a result also of the re-election of Donald Trump. But I would like to focus on Russia for a moment, because in the top risks for 2025, one of the events that you've highlighted is Russian influence in changing the global geopolitical order, really. How do you characterize that going forward, particularly when we know that that's not necessarily new, but perhaps it's becoming a little bit more effective? If I think about the election in Romania and what happened there, guide us through your thoughts in terms of Russia could be influencing the political order going forward.
Well, the overarching theme of the report is what we at Eurasia Group like to call the G0 world, which is just a way to describe, the seismic geopolitical shift away from a US-led, multilateral, largely rules-based order towards what you could call, the law of the jungle, as it were, where no single power takes responsibility for upholding global norms. This is an oversimplification, of course. The system wasn't perfect before, and elements of the international system will remain in place. But still, this is, I think, a recipe for endemic instability, for economic dislocation in particular, and ultimately for conflict. And this has a lot to do with Trump, of course, but we think of Trump more as a symptom and a beneficiary rather than an agent of this change, I would say. And actually the roots go much deeper, and among those I would actually point to the failure to better integrate Russia into the West after the Cold War. Now, where does it leave us today? As I said, prospects for a ceasefire are fairly good, I think, but no comprehensive peace agreement, which would require essentially a formal recognition of Russian territorial gains in Ukraine, not just de facto recognition, in exchange for security guarantees on the part of either NATO or the US, which the US is unwilling to provide, and Russia is actually unwilling to accept. So this means that, a halt to the fighting, but one that might be weak, unstable, potentially short-lived, and relations between Russia and Europe remaining bad, no sanctions being lifted, and Russia continuing, as I said, to use asymmetric means such as election interference to interfere with NATO countries.